Imagine standing in an ancient Greek palace where torchlight flickers across marble walls, casting golden glints on statues of gods. The air is thick with the scent of pine resin and smoke, but something else lingers, a silent secret woven into the grandeur of these halls. You step into a hidden chamber where an intricately carved throne looms, and on it sits a young king, his eyes clouded with unspoken pain. His body, draped in a shimmering embroidered robe, bears strange marks. An elongated head, narrow shoulders, and trembling hands, though he's barely in his 20s. The palace's golden glow cannot hide the truth. This king, revered as a god, is a victim of a curse his ancestors unknowingly sowed. This is no myth or bedtime story to scare children. It's the real history of some of ancient Greece's most powerful rulers who governed an empire stretching from the Mediterranean coast to Egypt's deserts, yet destroyed themselves through centuries of inbreeding. They believed their blood was divine, too sacred to mingle with commoners. But that belief, like a poisoned seed, grew into a genetic tragedy, turning their splendid palaces into prisons of suffering and death. These kings and queens, worshipped as divine by their subjects, lived lives tormented by the very bloodline they cherished. I think back to summer evenings at my grandmother's house, when she'd share stories of the past, her voice low and steady, pulling history into the present. She'd say history isn't just dates or names of kings, it's about people, about what happens when they're caught between belief and truth. The story of the Greek royal family, especially the Ptolemaic dynasty, is one such lesson. They didn't mean to create suffering. They thought they were protecting something sacred, like a child clutching a precious gem, unaware it's already cracked. But each marriage between siblings, each prayer for the purity of their bloodline, was like a silent cut deepening their tragedy. Picture that young king on his throne. He's been taught he's a descendant of gods, that the blood in his veins carries the light of Zeus and Hera. Yet every morning, he wakes to aching bones and shallow breaths in a misshapen chest. His subjects kneel before him, but their eyes dart away, as if afraid to face the truth. He doesn't know that his ancestors, who founded the Ptolemaic dynasty after Alexander the Great's death, laid the foundation for his pain. They looked to Egypt's temples, where pharaohs married their sisters, and decided that was the path to secure power. They didn't see the tombs filled with stillborn infants, or the statues hiding deformed bodies. They saw only glory. What happens when the world's most powerful people, seen as invincible, trap themselves in a cycle of suffering? What if those dazzling palaces weren't paradises, but places where kings and queens faced their own fragility? This story, like an old, dusty book, opens pages of history about pride, blindness, and ultimately, redemption through the wisdom of those who came later. We'll journey into that world, from the early days of the Ptolemaic dynasty to the tragedy of Cleopatra, to see that even gods on earth couldn't escape the consequences of their mistakes. As you hear this story, wherever you are in the world, ask yourself, what can we learn from the shadows beneath that golden light? Let's explore together, like kids hearing about a lost world for the first time, one that still echoes in our hearts. When I was a kid, I'd sit under the old oak tree in our backyard, listening to my grandfather tell stories about a time when people believed the sun was a god driving a fiery chariot across the sky. Those tales, as wondrous as they were, always left me with a lingering question. How could people believe something so fiercely, even when it led them to ruin? The story of the Greek royal family, particularly the Ptolemaic dynasty and their practice of inbreeding, is one such tale. It didn't start with malice, but with a deep conviction that their blood was divine, that preserving its purity was the only way to safeguard their glory and power. Yet, like a stone path winding into a dark forest, that belief led them to a place no one could have foreseen, a labyrinth of pain and tragedy. To understand why the Greek kings, who ruled a dazzling empire after the death of Alexander the Great, chose this path. We need to step back to the 4th century BCE, when the ancient world was shaken by conquests and divisions. Alexander, often compared to a lightning bolt from Zeus, left behind a vast but fragile empire. When he died in 323 BCE, his generals, known as the Diadochi, carved up his lands, ruling territories from Greece to Egypt. Among them was Ptolemy, a shrewd and ambitious man who claimed Egypt and declared himself king. Standing on the banks of the Nile, gazing at the ancient temples of the pharaohs, he saw a lesson. To rule a people who worshiped their king as a god, he had to become a god in their eyes. For centuries, Egyptians believed their pharaohs were the embodiment of Horus, son of the sun god Ra. To preserve that divinity, pharaohs often married their sisters, convinced that only divine blood could mingle with divine blood. Ptolemy I, though a practical Macedonian, recognized the power of this tradition. Inbreeding wasn't just a religious ritual. It was a political tool, a way to keep power within the family and avoid risky alliances with foreign dynasties. So, he and his successors decided. Siblings in the Ptolemaic royal family would marry each other to protect their sacred blood and strengthen the throne. They didn't see that each marriage, like a drop of ink in clear water, was clouding the very bloodline they revered. But this belief wasn't driven by cold calculation alone. There was an almost childlike innocence in how they viewed the world. The Ptolemaic kings grew up in magnificent palaces, taught that they were descendants of Greek gods, their blood carrying the light of Olympus. They looked at their subjects, farmers, craftsmen, and merchants, and felt an unbridgeable divide. How could a god mix their blood with a mortal? How could a descendant of Zeus marry a woman from a distant land? Their priests and advisors, always eager to please, nodded in agreement. They praised the purity of the royal bloodline, wrote poems celebrating sibling marriages, and turned a dangerous choice into a sacred tradition. At first, the consequences were subtle, like a hairline crack in a stone wall that doesn't yet topple a temple. A child born with a slightly unusual face, a young king dying earlier than expected. These signs were hidden by flawless statues and fervent prayers. Priests called deformities marks of the divine. Historians recorded early deaths as summons from the gods. No one dared face the truth, because doing so would mean questioning the very belief that shaped their world. Each incestuous marriage, each prayer for purity, was another stone added to the wall, separating them from reality. But that wall couldn't stand forever. The blood they worshipped, like a river dammed too long, began to stagnate and turn toxic. Children were born frail. Kings grew up with twisted bodies, and dreams of glory were slowly overshadowed by the darkness of suffering. The story of the Ptolemaic dynasty, like a book written in blood, begins with pages of pride, but each chapter that follows serves as a warning of the cost of blindness. As a kid, I once saw a sparrow with a broken wing, flapping weakly on the grass behind our house, trying to fly but falling back in despair. I cried, not because the bird was weak, but because it seemed unaware why the sky was so out of reach. Years later, reading about Ptolemy IV, a king of the Ptolemaic dynasty, I saw that sparrow in him, a man born to sit on a throne, yet bound by his body and fate, unable to soar despite the golden sheen of his royal wings. Ptolemy IV, who ruled Egypt from 221 to 204 BCE, was a living symbol of the tragedy his ancestors had sown, a tragedy etched into his very flesh by generations of inbreeding. Ptolemy IV, also known as Philopator, lover of his father, grew up in the palace of Alexandria, where marble walls reflected the Mediterranean's light and libraries held the world's wisdom. But that splendid palace was a gilded cage, where he and his sister, Arsinoe III, were raised to believe they were living gods. descendants of Zeus and Hera. Following Ptolemaic tradition, they were destined to marry not out of love, but from a sacred notion that only their blood was worthy of blending. I imagine Ptolemy IV as a boy, racing through vast corridors, laughing with Arsinoe, unaware that their childhood games would soon give way to a grim duty. How could a child grasp that the adults around them, with their prayers and songs, were weaving a net that would bind their entire lives? But that net wasn't just royal duty. It was in Ptolemy IV's very body. Ancient historians, careful in their words, noted he was frail from childhood, plagued by frequent illnesses, headaches, and shallow breaths that interrupted lavish banquets. Some whispered his eyes had a weary look, his hands trembling as he held the scepter. These signs, which we now recognize as the effects of inbreeding, were hidden by the court with ornate robes and poems praising the king's divine strength. But no one could hide the truth from Ptolemy himself. I picture him standing before a bronze mirror in the palace, seeing a face unlike the perfect statues of his ancestors, wondering if the gods truly stood by him. His marriage to Arsinoe III, his sister, was a ceremony steeped in Alexandria's grandeur golden litters, soaring hymns, and cheers from subjects. Yet behind the spectacle was a quiet pain. Arsinoe, also carrying Ptolemaic blood, wasn't a stranger but his childhood companion, sharing his dreams and fears. How could they see each other as husband and wife when memories of carefree days still lingered? Their children, like Ptolemy, were born frail, bearing the marks of their genetic curse children, the court called the light of the gods, but who rarely survived childhood. Ptolemy IV's pain wasn't just physical. It was the isolation he endured. As a king, he was surrounded by hundreds of advisors, priests, courtiers, but none dared speak the truth about his health, the pains that kept him awake, or the children who never grew up. Historians say he turned to wine and revelry to escape reality, but I don't see that as decadence. I see a man trying to flee his own darkness, like that sparrow flapping its broken wing, knowing it can't fly. Ptolemy IV's reign, though marked by moments of glory, signaled the decline of the Ptolemaic Empire. His advisors, rather than facing the truth, kept praising the tradition of inbreeding, as if their songs could mend the cracks in the royal bloodline. But those cracks ran too deep, and Ptolemy IV, though called a god, was only a human carrying both the glory and the curse of his ancestors. His story, like a somber chapter in the book of history, reminds us that even the most dazzling thrones cannot hide the fragility of humanity. Growing up, I'd spend hours lost in books about far-off places, imagining queens with crowns that sparkled like stars. Cleopatra, the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, was one of those figures and name that conjured images of beauty, power, and mystery. But the real Cleopatra wasn't just a legend. She was a woman born into a family crumbling under the weight of its own history. Ruling Egypt from 51 to 30 BCE, Cleopatra VII was the final chapter of a dynasty shaped by inbreeding. A woman who fought to preserve her throne while carrying the scars of her ancestors' choices. Her story, like a tapestry frayed at the edges, shows both the brilliance and the tragedy of the Ptolemaic bloodline. Cleopatra was born in Alexandria, a city of dazzling libraries and temples, but also a place where the Ptolemaic tradition of sibling marriage had left its mark. Her parents, likely siblings or close relatives, passed down a bloodline weakened by generations of inbreeding. Yet Cleopatra herself seemed to defy the curse, at least on the surface. Ancient sources describe her as sharp-witted and charismatic, with a voice that could charm anyone. She spoke 9 languages, mastered diplomacy, and ruled with a vision that kept Egypt independent longer than seemed possible. But beneath her strength, I imagine moments of quiet fear, knowing her family's history. Did she ever look at her siblings Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV and see the frailty that haunted their line? Did she wonder if her own children would inherit the same fate? Following tradition, Cleopatra married her younger brothers, first Ptolemy the 13th and then Ptolemy the 14th, to secure her throne. These weren't marriages of love, but of necessity, rooted in the Ptolemaic belief that royal blood must remain pure. I picture her standing in a grand hall, draped in golden robes, exchanging vows with a boy too young to understand the weight of their union. Her brothers, weakened by the same genetic flaws that plagued their ancestors, were no match for her. Ambition or intellect? Ptolemy the 13th died in a power struggle against her, and Ptolemy the 14th passed away under mysterious circumstances, possibly at Cleopatra's command. The court whispered of poison, but I see a woman desperate to break free from a cycle that bound her to frail co-rulers, knowing Egypt needed a stronger hand. Her children, including those with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, carried the hope of a new legacy, but also the shadow of the Ptolemaic curse. Her son Caesarion, born to Caesar, was said to be bright but delicate, a reminder of the bloodline's fragility. Her twins with Antony, Alexander Helios, and Cleopatra Selene survived into adulthood, but their lives were marked by the fall of their mother's kingdom. I think of Cleopatra cradling her children, whispering dreams of empires, while secretly praying they'd escape the ailments that claimed so many Ptolemies before them. The ancient world saw her as a goddess, but she was also a mother, haunted by a history she couldn't rewrite. Cleopatra's reign was a high-wire act, balancing alliances with Rome against the growing cracks in her dynasty. She dazzled Caesar and Antony, not just with beauty, but with a mind that matched theirs, securing Egypt's place in a world dominated by Roman power. Yet her family's legacy of inbreeding weakened her court. Her siblings' frail health and early deaths left her isolated, forcing her to rely on foreign allies rather than her own kin. The Ptolemaic Empire, once vast, was shrinking, its resources strained by internal strife and external threats. I see her late at night, poring over scrolls, searching for a way to save her kingdom, knowing the blood in her veins was both her crown and her chains dot her final days. After Antony's defeat at Actium and Rome's armies closing in, are the stuff of legend. Rather than face capture, Cleopatra chose death, reportedly by the bite of an asp. I imagine her in that moment, not as a defeated queen, but as someone reclaiming her story, refusing to let Rome write its ending. Her death in 30 BCE marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line that had burned brightly but was consumed by its own flaws. The palaces of Alexandria fell silent, their golden light dimmed, but Cleopatra's name lived on not as a victim, but as a woman who fought against fate. Cleopatra's story, like the final page of a worn book, leaves us with a question. What does it mean to inherit a legacy that's both a gift and a curse? She was the last Ptolemy, a queen who shone despite the shadows of her bloodline, but couldn't outrun its consequences. Her life reminds us that even the most powerful among us are shaped by the choices of those who came before, and that true strength lies in facing those truths, no matter how heavy they are. On lazy summer afternoons, when golden sunlight spilled across the fields of my hometown, I'd sit with my grandfather, listening to him talk about the cycles of life mistakes people repeat, like rivers carving their way to the sea despite every obstacle. He'd say history isn't a straight line but a circle, where old lessons keep circling back, waiting for us to notice. The story of the Ptolemaic dynasty, from Ptolemy I's ambitious beginnings to Cleopatra's tragic end, is one such circle, a pattern of pride, blindness, and suffering, repeating across centuries like stones stacked high, only to collapse under their own weight. Building on our journey through Alexandria's palaces, where we saw Ptolemy IV struggle like a broken-winged sparrow and Cleopatra blaze like an unyielding flame, we now step back to see the bigger picture, realizing their tragedy wasn't an accident, but a fateful human pattern. The Ptolemaic dynasty, as we've seen from Ptolemy's radiant early days, began with a fierce belief that their blood was divine, that inbreeding would preserve their glory and power. But that belief, like a toxic seed sown in fertile soil, sprouted into suffering. Each generation, from Ptolemy IV's frail body to Cleopatra's desperate fight against her family's curse, was a loop in this cycle. Genetic isolation led to decline, followed by brief recovery, when foreign marriages brought fresh blood, only to return to the old path when power fueled arrogance. We saw this in Ptolemy IV, when his court hid his illnesses with divine hymns, and in Cleopatra, when her hopes were crushed by Roman politics. But this pattern isn't unique to Egypt. It echoes in later dynasties, like the Habsburgs in Europe, where inbreeding also produced kings with deformed jaws and weakened bodies, a painful echo of the Ptolemaic story. Modern science, like a lantern, cutting through the fog of superstition, explains why these cycles were so devastating. When siblings marry, their children face a high risk of inheriting two copies of harmful recessive genes that, in a diverse population, are usually masked by healthy copies from unrelated parents. Each generation of inbreeding, like a clumsy weaver, tightens the genetic thread, exposing flaws no one dared name. Children born with twisted bones, weak hearts, or troubled minds were like letters from the past, warning of the cost of isolation. But in Alexandria's palaces, as we've seen, those letters were ignored, buried under perfect statues and fervent prayers. The Ptolemaic tragedy wasn't just about weakened bodies. It was about a deeper human pain. Picture the princes and princesses like Ptolemy IV or Cleopatra, growing up in splendid but cold rooms, never playing with ordinary children, never loving without the burden of bloodlines. They were kids, like my brother and me, running through fields, but forced, wear crowns and live on the edge between divine and human. Every early death, every child who didn't survive infancy, was a scar on the hearts of mothers like Arsinoe or Cleopatra, who knew their children were victims of a tradition they couldn't break. That loneliness, like a cold wind sweeping through a palace, was something no throne could dispel. Yet from these painful cycles, we find a lesson, like my grandfather pointing to the night sky and saying each star is a story. The Ptolemaic saga teaches us that isolation, whether genetic, cultural, or ideological, always leads to decline. Diversity, like a river flowing freely, brings strength and life. As we look back at Alexandria's ruined palaces, we see not just tragedy, but a reminder. Even the most powerful must learn to let go of flawed beliefs to move toward the light. This story, stretching from Ptolemy I's early days through Ptolemy IV's struggles and Cleopatra's defiance, is a mirror for us today, urging us not to repeat the painful circles of the past. As a child, evenings on our porch always ended with a silvery moon hanging in the sky, and my grandmother's warm, lullaby-like voice reminding me that every story, no matter how sad, carries a seed of hope. She'd say history isn't just dusty pages, but a mirror, showing us who we are, our mistakes, our dreams, and our power to change. As we close the story of the Ptolemaic dynasty, from the radiant glory of Alexandria's palaces under Ptolemy I through Ptolemy IV's pain and Cleopatra's unyielding spirit, I see that mirror gleaming, not only with tragedy, but with profound lessons about humanity. Our journey, from opulent corridors to the painful cycles of inbreeding, now circles back to where we began. A crumbling palace, its golden light faded, but its truth still shining. Picture yourself standing among Alexandria's ruins, where marble walls once witnessed Ptolemy IV, a broken-winged sparrow struggling with his frail body. Think of Cleopatra, a flame blazing through the darkness, daring to dream of a different future for her children. though fate stole that dream away. These kings and queens, as we've seen in earlier chapters, weren't just victims of a genetic curse sown by their ancestors. They were proof of the cost of blind belief, the belief that isolation, whether genetic or ideological, could bring strength. But as we discussed with the damned river, isolation only leads to stagnation and poison. The Ptolemaic dynasty, with its cycles of pride and suffering, is a warning that no one, no matter how powerful, can escape the consequences of misguided choices. If Ptolemy I, standing on the Nile's banks and adopting Egypt's traditions, could speak to us today, he might say true power lies not in purity, but in diversity like rivers merging to nourish the land. If Ptolemy IV, haunted by sleepless, pain-filled nights, could share a word, he might urge us to listen to our bodies and hearts, not blind hymns of praise. And if Cleopatra, with her sharp mind and fearless heart, could send the message across millennia, I believe she'd push us to choose love and life over the chains of tradition. Modern science, as we noted in the last chapter, has lit up the truth they couldn't see. Genetic diversity is strength, and every harmful recessive gene is a reminder of the value of connection. This story, like those porch evenings when my grandmother spun tailies, isn't just for remembering the past, but for acting in the present. We, living in an age of light and knowledge, have a duty to learn from those ruined palaces. Let the Ptolemaic tragedy remind us that isolation, whether in thought, culture, or society, leads to decline. Let Cleopatra's wisdom inspire us to question outdated traditions and build a world where people can mingle freely, like rivers flowing to the sea. I invite you, who've walked this journey with me from every corner of the world, as we shared in the early chapters, to spread this story. If Ptolemy IV's pain moves you, or Cleopatra's fire inspires you, hit the like button, share this tale with friends, and drop a comment about what stirs your heart. Is it the lesson of diversity, or the resilience of humans facing fate? Each action, like a pebble tossed into a lake, sends ripples outward, carrying history's message to others. Together, like friends gathered around a campfire, let's keep the flame of knowledge burning, ensuring past tragedies don't repeat and letting hope's light guide our future.